Ladies and gentlemen, this is the start of our conference. Before me, I would like to welcome Dr. Craig to come and welcome our guests and introduce the conference themes.
This conference has come together very quickly, and I need to acknowledge the amazing work that has been put together primarily by Matthew. Because of the short timeline, a number of NGOs that are actually active in the South Sudan region were unfortunately unable to attend. Both Anglicort, World Vision, and I believe Oxfam are all holding retreats these very same days to discuss their Sudan programs. We have a rather eclectic agenda. We've tried to put it into themes that certainly are coherent and leap from one to another. We are drawing upon some of our networks, a number of contributions from other countries, particularly Indonesia, Timor Leste. All this mix of information, we certainly leave it to the Sudanese participants here to take what you can, leave the rest, to try to understand how these lessons might apply to the situation in Southern Sudan. The theme of the conference is dialogue. We don't want to have people give speeches about dialogue. We want to actually have a dialogue. Now we have a very, very tight agenda, and so I think without further ado, actually, we might want to just move straight into things. And we're very, very privileged. Welcome Dr. Balthasar Kehi from Timor Leste, who will be giving a keynote address on post-referendum experiences in Timor Leste.
I want to say something about the commonly received idea of post-conflict society or post-conflict nation. Post-referendum Timor Leste is sometimes seen as a post-conflict society. The idea of post-conflict society is a misleading sociological concept. The post-war or the post-violence society perhaps would be the right term to use because of the conflicts are not necessarily negative and destructive, as there are violence conflict and non-violence conflict. It is the violence conflicts which are destructive for peace and for human life and society. As violent conflicts are necessary for the development of human mind and society. Without them, mind and society become stagnant and do not know how to proceed, challenge human mind and society to grow and to think otherwise. The denial of non-violent conflict may lead to dictatorship or tyranny as in the case of Indonesia or other dictatorship in the world. Development does not necessarily result in or lead to peace and equal distribution of economic development. It is in the name of God, of development, of progress, that violence against nature, against other living creatures and human beings, against other nations and culture have been committed. It is not possible that Timor's relatively equal traditional society can become very developed, but at the same time very unequal. And confronting the reality of violence that happened in the past is important for preventing, minimizing, and dealing with violence in the future, and for creating a peaceful coexistence. A violent conflict is a social reality. The history of humanity is also the history of violence conflict. There is no civilization without violence and barbarism. Wars are not made by the common people. They are declared by political, military, economic elites to serve their own greed for power and money or resources. But it is the common people who are exploited to fight the war and suffer its consequences. Thus, the history of Timor is not only the history of peace, but also the history of violence. It is the violence that occurred during the pre-colonial Timor among Timorese, during the colonial Timor under the Portuguese and the Dutch, who divided Timorese and their country into West and East Timor, under the Japanese and the Australian during the World War II, then under Portuguese again until 75, and later under Indonesia until 99. And during the post-colonial Timor, particularly in the violent conflict in 2006 and 2008. The post-independent violence that occurred in December 2000 and that erupted in April 2006 and had lasted more than 1 year, and that occurred again in February 2008. The post-independence violence is the continuation rather than cessation of violence that they fought against during the colonial occupation. East Timorese fought so hard against the Indonesian military brutality and corruption and paid such high price for that. But after the independence, the East Timorese brutalized each other, and the corruption is even worse than that in Indonesia at the moment. It is admirable and ennobling that the Timorese leadership had the courage to embrace their former oppressor and forgive their past crime. But why don't the Timorese leaders embrace each other and forgive each other's crimes or mistakes, which are very small or minor, in order to work together to build peace in this new nation? In spite of its significant success, the post-referendum conflict in Timor Leste is also partly the failure of the international community in the project of building peace in such a tiny nation. Only 10% of 8 billion foreign aid in the past 10 years went to the Timorese, and this 10% mainly to the elite Timorese. In the case of Cambodia, it was 11%. If the UN and the international community were not so successful in building peace and democracy in such a small and simple society like Timor, how could they establish peace and democracy in a huge and complex country like Iraq or Afghanistan? During the months of violence in Dili in 2006, why this violence conflict happened in Dili, where there were so many people, local NGOs and NGOs, local and international, working for peace building and conflict resolution, and where there are so many international advisors and experts, and where the most school or educated Timorese are. But why did not happen in the rural areas where there are hardly any sophisticated peace builders, conflict resolution experts, and well-schooled Timorese? Violent conflict in East Timor need to be understood in global and regional perspective, as is often the case when small countries in third world are rich in natural resources. They are often worse because of greed to monopolize those resources by the greedy people within and outside the countries. What gives rise to different forms of violence is perhaps their limited greed or insatiable appetite to possess power over others and to have more money for oneself as individual or as group without sharing and solidarity. Two sides of post-referendum Timor. Indeed, the struggle for freedom that sought human spirit during the oppression has replaced to some extent by the struggle for power after liberation. What's happened in Poland to some extent happens in post-oppression East Timor and other post-oppression or post-violence societies. Today, two Timor-Leste confront one another. A Timor of suspicion, envy, and corruption is fighting a Timor of hope, openness, tolerance. Positive, very one of the things in East Timor. In terms of religious tolerance, East Timor is a Catholic country and Christian country, 98% Christian Catholics. And the Catholic Church plays such an important role during the struggle for independence. But its first prime minister was not a Christian, not a Catholic, but but a Muslim. And that hasn't happened in many different parts of the world, whether in Islamic country, de facto Islamic country, or de facto Christian countries.
There are many very important lessons in the first 10 years of Timor Leste's independence that certainly can provide some important lessons for the people of South Sudan. I'd like to now, our second address this morning is Dr. Libby Tudball, who will be talking about professional communities and learning.
What I'm going to do is what I was asked to do by Matthew, and that is to be one of the people who commences the dialogue, who starts to alert all of us to some of the very important issues that we need to consider around making action happen and achieving peace. Now, I've learned a lot. I needed to read a little bit about what your nation has been through. And I've learned a lot about your long periods of war and struggle, of hostility, of intervention, of loss, of hunger. I've learned also about the various levels of success in peacemaking that so far you've been able to achieve. And I'm very well aware of the kind of hopes that you have. And in a minute, we're going to start to begin to identify what your hopes are out of this forum, but in the longer term, for your nation and for your communities. What I wanted to share very briefly with you is some of the literature, global literature, the learned ones who tell us how these things can happen in practice. There are all over the world speeches and leaders who've told us these things, but what are some of the hallmarks, the really critical things that we need to bear in mind for action to occur? And we're going to use the two concepts of communities of practice, which I know many of you are already very much involved in communities of practice, and professional learning communities. There is grand theories written about these things, but what I'd like us to do together is cut to the chase and work out what are the critical learnings that these theories tell us that will allow us to go forward. And how can you work collaboratively to set the goals and the visions and the processes to create change? And look, Cruz, Lewis and Brick say that for us to achieve peace, action, strategic change, that leaders and administrators must work collaboratively to seek this change. There must be a clear definition of what is the mission, what are the goals, what are the values that we want to share, how can we reflect on what's working, what's not working, and what we need to do to actually take action. Hargraves also said that when colleagues work together, they give each other the moral support and the collective energy to be able to make things happen. Thank you. There are certain factors that are seen to be critical in this whole process of creating change and action. First of all, that a community of practice is defined by the knowledge of the members. Here is where your knowledge, your shared knowledge, just as Craig said, remembering history, your past, what's happened in your communities, is critical in your work in defining what do we want to make happen next. It's very important also that new roles are recognised, that each situation is different, and the situation you're in now in going ahead towards the referendum is a very changed situation from a much more troubled past. The motivation to share knowledge is critical, and that's why we're here today. And it's important when you see that you have a moral obligation and a shared community interest in this action. The blockers. What are the blockers? And we heard some of those in the keynote, that there have been serious issues that Timor Leste has had to overcome in order to progress in their action. Often it's because of egos, personal attacks, too many people involved, time constraints. But to succeed, to overcome those blockers, and with clear purpose and clear objectives, there are certain things that need to happen. First of all, this community of practice you're involved in working towards peace in action will evolve naturally. There needs to be different levels of participation from the leaders, those that are working at the governmental level, right through all the layers and structures in your community. And in a minute we're going to get on to the action in defining what those might be. Wenger says there's 3 main levels of participation. There's a core group who are intensely working in discussions and programs. Second, there is others underneath the leaders who need to be pulled in, and that second layer, the leadership and the layers of the distributed leaders who work with those that are intensely involved in this process. And a peripheral group in the wider communities that you're working in as well. These conversations need to be developed in public spaces such as this, but also in private spaces where ideas can actually be discussed. And the focus of these communities of practice should be to actually define what the actions are going to be. There needs to be a rhythm and a continuous process that continues so that meetings are regular and there are reflections so that there is vibrancy maintained within the community. So what do leaders say is necessary for action? Working together, working out when are we going to meet, where are we going to meet, how are we going to meet, and why. Sustaining a level of communication and sharing your thoughts. How is that going to happen? Celebrating your success as you go along. How and why and who with and how will these things happen? Developing mutual respect and trust and a shared sense of loyalty amongst the groups are critical as well. So your question that we're going to start talking about now then is how can these things be achieved? So what I'm going to send around is a summary of these, a series of key questions that need to be addressed. What I'd like you to do is to look at the questions, grab a pen and sit next to 1 or 2 people and start to talk through. This is the beginning of the dialogue around the critical elements of community practice. We're going to take about, where's our timekeeper Matthew, 10 minutes for the initial collaboration.